This is Balmy Shores by J. Wilburn. Chandler Epps stepped out on his porch overlooking the Atlantic where the last of his screen flapped in the breeze. It was coming in strong off the water. Okay, what is it? I didn't say what it was, so the breeze, I guess. Okay, let's say the wind. I don't know that I was completely clear. The wind was coming in strong off the water, but nothing compared to the hurricane of the previous night. The morning sun showed all the fronds scattered on the beach and the heavier debris spilling inland on the island. Let's say on their island, so it's more specific, they live here. It wasn't fun getting caught by surprise, but the television and radio stations had been off the air for years now. Let's say every storm was a surprise now. Chandler glanced over and saw Randolph King already on his back porch. Randolph lifted his cup and asked, "Coffee?" Chandler held up the plastic bottle he had just filled from the rain barrel that had brimmed its top. Randolph's coffee was more roots than beans and upset Chandler's stomach. He didn't know how the old guy kept drinking the stuff. Alright, let's fix that real quick. He stretched his back. He was no young man himself, and Randolph was 20 years his elder. "We have a new neighbor," Randolph called. "Run out and change the population sign to 3, would you?" Chandler's heart raced for a moment. As far as he knew, they were the only two living people within hundreds of miles, if not thousands. Randolph motioned with his mug, and Chandler's blood ran cold as he saw the 20-foot alligator sunning on the sand below Randolph's porch. Chandler cursed and Randolph laughed. He shook his head and walked out. Okay, let's say who this is specifically. Chandler shook his head and walked out to the corner of his porch away from the gator and leaned over. From here he could see a couple miles of the bridge leading to the mainland. Looked like it was still standing and gleaming white like always. Alright. Balmy Shores was an island 6 miles off the coast of North Carolina. That southern part... Yeah, I'm okay. Are you talking to me? I'm doing all right. That southern part of the state that jutted due east so that the shore actually faced south. This was the cursed piece... Yes, okay, I didn't mean to say that. This was the cursed piece of land that caught every hurricane that missed South Carolina. That bridge led to Holden Beach, which had been eroding away for decades before the end of the world. From there, it sort of connected into Highway 130 to head inland. The bridge was called the James Terry Sanford Causeway, but locals, back when there were locals, called it Hurricane Run because that was its primary use. It was built because a lieutenant governor at the time owned the palatial house Chandler had used since coming here to live out whatever days he had left. Folks on the mainland called the bridge Sanford's Folly because Balmy Shores wasn't worth the drive unless you owned one of the few houses there. The island was a curved hook of land that was only 7 miles long and less than a mile across at its widest point. The bridge connected to the northwestern end. Chandler and Randolph lived next door to each other, 2/3 of the way along the southern beach in the biggest two houses on the island. After 3 hurricanes, only Chandler's and Randolph's places still stood, and Chandler's was leaking now. It wasn't fair to Sanford because it wasn't fair to Sanford to call it his folly. Let's say to call the bridge. I had added some stuff here, and so this comment's more distant from the one that inspired it. It wasn't fair to Sanford to call the bridge his folly because he had been dead by the time the bridge project started. Now most everyone else in the world was dead too. How'd your place hold up? Chandler startled and almost dropped his water. With the alligator down there, he would have left it. Lost a couple more windows and got a couple leaks I guess I need to patch. Randolph said, "That's a shame. We're running low on glass. I'll have to board them over. Place will be dark if you do that." "Well, Randolph, I'm not expecting much company. Mr. Gator just got here. I guess he's staying with me." "He's not staying with me, Randolph. That's for damn sure." "You can come live over here if that place is finally given up the ghost." Chandler thought about it. It made sense. They had enough trouble keeping things up on the island. 2 houses seemed a bit much. All right. Finally, he shook his head. "No, we've given up too much already. Don't want to leave the place yet." Let's say just yet. I know you shouldn't edit in justs, but I think it works for the dialogue. All right. A shotgun nearly made Chandler throw up in his mouth. He held his chest. No, a gunshot nearly made Chandler throw up in his mouth. He held his chest and turned to see Randolph aiming a rifle one-handed over the edge of his porch. The gator had started to crawl up the beach, but it wasn't moving anymore. Randolph winked at Chandler and raised his mug. "Meat. We'll get started processing him when I finish this cup. There's a lot of cleanup, too. We got nothing but time, don't we, friend?" All right. Chandler feared, cutting up the alligator took a lot of the morning. They barely... All right. Let me fix a typo here. Got the wrong word. They barely put a dent in the cleanup that day. 2 of their greenhouses had to be repaired. 1 shed was destroyed. They spent a week clearing and salvaging all those tools. They discussed rebuilding it, but in the end, they just made room in Randolph's garage for the stuff they saved. It was almost... thanks for the follow. I'd missed that earlier on. It was almost worth all the effort once he tasted the cooked gator. After 4 days, he was sick. He was sick of it, but he knew in a couple weeks, after eating mostly fish, he'd miss the alligator meat. They were always on the edge. Hey, thanks for being here, man. I appreciate it. Always appreciate you guys popping into chat to let me know you're here too. That's nice. They were always on the edge of losing their supply of vegetables. Thank you for the follow. Appreciate that very much. They were always on the edge of losing their supply of vegetables and fruit from the lack of cooperation of nature, and that was even without the hurricanes. One morning, Chandler spotted Randolph on the beach without his coffee. He took a big straw hat off the hook and strapped it on his head as he crossed the sand. Chandler heard the click of the Geiger counter before he saw it around Randolph's bulk. It didn't sound too congested with its rattling, so that was good. He asked anyway, "Are we going to start glowing yet?" "Oh, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it." All right. "Are we going to start glowing yet?" Randolph sniffed into the breeze and turned the device off. "Not today. I'm not sure how many more storms it'll be before that stuff makes it this far." Chandler nodded. There wasn't much to say about that. And there wasn't a bridge to take them any further out, so this was their final stand. They already knew that too, though. All right, let me change this to a period. Mostly just grammar and punctuation I've been correcting so far. No root coffee today? Randolph sniffed again. "No, I've been fighting heartburn for a couple days. I miss it, but need to detox a bit, I guess." Chandler glanced at the silent radiation detector and then stared out over the water. What do you want to do today?" Randolph said, "I sure could go for some hookers and blow." Chandler choked on his spit, laughing. "All right, we'll call that Plan B if we find some radiation suits and decide to walk the bridge again. What are we actually going to do today?" "Work on the heaters, I think." Chandler glanced at the sun and back at Randolph. "Whatever you say." All right, let me center that. "I know it's summer, but it won't be forever. Let's say this is North Carolina, not Florida. Winter's coming and all that jazz. The ant versus the grasshopper. You know what I mean. We need those greenhouses heated in winter or will have scurvy by spring. I'm your grasshopper, Chandler said. Lead the way. Randolph walked a little slower that day, but Chandler knew they were both getting older. They were going to slow right down until their tickers stopped winding. Chandler thought he was prepared for that. But this was the last he saw Randolph alive, and he wasn't prepared at all. He was in the middle of taking care of a body here, so let's get back to that. But Chandler dug a proper grave in one of the overgrown yards where the beach house had already been reduced to the foundation. What the two of them had not repurposed before now was gone into the sea. Now Randolph King, Chandler's last friend in the world, was gone too. Digging the hole was backbreaking. Rolling the sheet-wrapped body into the hole was heartbreaking. Raking that dirt back over the body ruined Chandler's joints and his soul. As the sun set beyond the mainland end of the bridge, Chandler remained on his throbbing knees with blistered hands and his head bowed low. He should say something, he thought, but he always felt stupid talking to himself. Randolph couldn't hear, and if God was really out there, he had clearly stopped listening a long time ago. So Chandler said nothing. He might have fallen asleep on his knees, or he just faded out until he snapped back to himself in the full darkness. Randolph, were he able to haunt the island, would scold Chandler for wasting the body. Let me change a tense here, I'm sorry. He'd want Chandler to make soap from his body fat, probably use the skin for something like they had done with the alligator. Randolph wasn't ever going to finish those matching boots he was so excited for them both to have. Chandler was running low on soap, but there wasn't anyone else around to notice anymore. He went back to his house and did not leave for days. Chandler did finally drift into the sun. Drift out into the sun. I want to be clear of what's going on here. Drift out into the sun again. He fixed food for himself, he collected water, he tended the plants, and kept up his fruit intake as Randolph had taught him. Randolph had been here on the island the day Chandler walked across that long bridge. After a quick radiation check, Randolph had welcomed him like an old friend. They had prepared to welcome others, but none ever came. Chandler found his way into Randolph's empty house. Many of the tools were kept here. He didn't really know what should be done next, and it didn't help that he barely cared. He put on some records from Randolph's collection. There were more modern groups that the older man would play, but Chandler stuck to the very old oldies that Randolph loved the most. He didn't cry himself to sleep. He was just numb. Maybe he dozed in and out. Maybe he just grayed out and stared at the wall all night. Either way, he didn't feel rested. So he returned to his dark and leaky house, where he slept through that day and into the next morning on sheets that really needed to be washed. All right, let me center this and save. Chandler tried to read a few books over again. He could never get himself focused enough. He took out his fishing gear because he knew he needed protein again soon, but he ended up leaving it on the porch. He took a walk around the island and stopped at the foot of the bridge. It was too far to see the end, so it looked like, let's call it by its nickname here. It looked like Hurricane Run stretched across the water into infinity. He returned home to sleep and ate a few more scraps from the garden. The next day he did fish and felt better after cooking and eating. He took another walk. Let me put in a missing word here. He took another walk, pausing at the foot of the bridge and stepping out along the center line between the lanes. He walked maybe half a mile, but returned home then. All right. Half a mile. Let's name the bridge again. Along Sanford's Folly, but returned home again. Okay. Each day he walked a little farther and farther, and let's say along the causeway. until he could see the foggy line of the mainland. His heart raced as he stood frozen, not wanting to go any further, but not bringing, let me put that word together, himself to go back. As night fell, he lost sight of the land, and that broke the spell. No lights were seen. The world had been dead for years. Now that Randolph was gone, he was waiting to die too. We were always waiting to die, just two old men too stubborn to know when to give up. Chandler finally turned back toward Balmy Shores. He could hear the waves crashing over the pylons below. The sun started to rise as he laid down to sleep. Okay. All right, let's move along here. The inevitable happened. Eventually, Chandler walked to the very edge of the bridge where it crossed land again on Holden Beach. Many of the buildings were flattened from the same hurricanes that had swept over the island. Beyond this stretch of beach, larger buildings, let me put a comma there to divide the clauses. Beyond this stretch of beach, larger buildings still stood, but without their glass. They appeared gutted and skeletal in the distance. He hesitated a while. He imagined just walking as far as the highways would take, but he knew it would be an empty world. Every surviving structure would be a tomb to the last civilization. Eventually, the radiation closer to the cities would bring him down in pain and suffering. Let's say Chandler's folly. He mumbled to himself. Okay, and that ties in some of that backstory there to the theme, so that works. Saves me from cutting all my beautiful backstory. If he wanted that, it would be easier just to walk out into the sea. He let out a long, slow breath and turned his back on the mainland. Balmy Shores had sustained and given him good days. Randolph King was responsible for much of that, but there was no reason to leave this empty place for a less hospitable one. He would die one day, but maybe today wasn't that day. When he got back, he checked himself with Randolph's Geiger counter. The needle hardly moved at all. Looks like I got away with being stupid one more time, old man. All right, center that. He slept soundly that night and took no more walks on the bridge. Chandler did catch a lot of fish and cooked them over a bonfire on the beach. It was a bit much, but he needed to celebrate still being alive somehow. All right, let's say that fire. Let's say that much fire. That much fire was a bit much, but he needed to celebrate still being alive somehow. The next day, he walked out on his porch with water from the rain barrel. He looked over at Randolph's empty porch and lifted his drink like old times. That morning he asked himself, what would Randolph do? That day he decided to carefully check and patch the roofs. Very carefully. One slip and he'd have broken bones with no one else to help him. All right. For the next several weeks, he planned his days like that. It took him longer than it would have with his old friend, but he got the heaters working in the greenhouses for winter. I believe greenhouses is compound. Should have learned that in grade school, but here I am learning it now. He even started clearing one of the old foundations to set up and build a new greenhouse. Chandler got to work planting new seeds so they would be ready when he got the new one built. He didn't need more food, especially now that it was just him, but gardens failed, so you needed backup, redundancy. That's what Randolph would do. One tradition he started on his own was listening to music at the end of the night, six days in a row. On every seventh day, he built a bonfire, mostly from the driftwood that came ashore. It was his way of celebrating. Let's say he had no idea what the real days of the week were anymore. All right. That last night on the beach, he had more fish than he could eat. He allowed the fire to burn itself out. If it took too long, the tide would solve it. Water washed away everything in time. He took the extra fish inside and left it on the counter. He'd have to eat what he could in the morning and then preserve the rest. All right. I believe we're in the home stretch here. Chandler walked past the fish the next morning. It smelled good, but he had a ritual to complete first. He took his water out on the porch, admired the new screen he had stapled in after he found enough of it around the island. He saluted the empty porch next door and asked, "What do you want to do today? What do you want to do today, old man?" There we go. All right. There was a knock at his front door. Chandler sort of locked in place. He didn't know what the hell to do with that. The knock came again, and he fought the urge to run screaming into the ocean. Chandler turned and, moved through his house to the front. There was more light since he replaced the boards over the broken windows. I left out a lot of words here when I got excited for the ending. With clear plastic. His hand rested on the handle, and he whispered to himself, "If this is you, Randolph, I'm going to die on the spot." He opened the door to a young woman and 4 younger children. They just stared at each other for a long time. "I'm Lori Tyndall," she said. Let's say finally, because they've been staring at each other a while. Said finally. Her voice was gravelly like a smoker. She was younger than Chandler by a lot, but probably older than most people considered young women. "This is Michelle, Pete, Dexter, and Sandra." The dirty children all waved. Chandler waved back. "We saw your fire, let's say, in the early morning," she said. "Where are you from?" "We've been lots of places, mostly on the coast, away from the hot zones." Chandler picked the Geiger counter up from one of the tables. "Do you mind if I..." "Please," she said. "I'm curious to know myself." It gave a big jump when he first turned it on, and so did his heart, but it died down quickly. They were clean. "Do you want some fish?" None of it went to waste. Chandler brought them some limes and other fruit from the greenhouses. He cut them into wedges the way his mom had done with apples for him years ago. The kids gobbled it up like candy. Chandler laughed out loud and then started crying. He tried to turn away, but Laurie hugged him, and she cried too. "It's amazing you kept them all alive this long." Say, he managed to say. "All right. None of them are mine," she said. "I found each of them alone and did the best I could. My friend Randolph would have respected that about you. I'm sorry you didn't get a chance to meet him. I am too. Is there room here for us?" Chandler laughed again. Randolph's home became Laurie and the kids' home. Let's say Laurie's and the kids' home. And kids is plural. Okay. They were not the last to arrive. The weekly bonfires helped a lot with that. Eventually, both houses were full. Let me put a comma there. And they started building new cabins on the north side of the island, away from many of the hurricanes. They expanded the gardens and kept each other fed. There were setbacks, there were tragedies. More people meant more losses, but they all faced it together. I want to add one piece in from earlier. One of the fellas who showed up long after Laurie. Okay, let me put commas here. One of the fellas who showed up long after Laurie finished the alligator skin boots Randolph had started. He gave one pair to Chandler. Chandler walked in them for a while, but they were a pain in the ass when he was working around the beach. He finally just put them on the mantle to be one more reminder of his old friend. Okay, good. There were setbacks, there were tragedies, more people meant more losses, but they all faced it together. Many hands made light work, and they made Balmy Shores a home while they healed, and the world slowly healed with them.